You're watching Midnight Creed, where every story hides a deep secret and an unexpected twist that will keep you on edge. If you love suspense, mysterious and thrilling tales, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Welcome to Midnight Creed. Let's start the story.
Chapter 1. Snow at the window. A stranger at the door, the blizzard arrived in the mountains with the theatrical certainty of a guest who has no intention of being refused. All winter the people of Rosenau Valley had lived under a cautious sky, watching clouds drift past like indifferent cattle. There had been thin falls now and then, pretty enough to dust rooftops, irritating enough to turn roads into brown slush, but never the deep, confident snow that tourists pay for and farmers curse at. The old men at the post office had parceled out their opinions with the slow authority of experience. "This is no winter," they said. "This is a bargain winter sold too cheaply." So when the storm finally came, it did not come politely. It came as a wall by mid-afternoon. The pass road had vanished, not in gentle carpeting, but in slanted sheets of white that erased distance and direction alike. A pine 30 yards away was a rumor. The low stone fences that kept cattle in summer were buried to the top rail. The world had become a narrow tunnel between falling sky and rising drifts, a place where sound did not echo but died, and where even a confident man could not be sure he was walking forward rather than sideways into a ditch. Those who were wise were already indoors. At the edge of the village, Pine Hollow Lodge stood with the stubbornness of something built to outlast weather. Once long ago, it had been a hunting house commissioned by a baron who liked comfort even while pretending to be rugged. It was long and low, its dark timber frame thick as a fist, its stone foundation broad enough to feel like bedrock. Over the years the village had grown and the baron had vanished into history, but the lodge remained, adapted and repainted, though never truly modernized. Its windows were deep, set and small, meant to hold warmth and keep out wolves. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady grey column, a quiet challenge to the wind. Each pane glowed amber, a small insistence that warmth existed even when the valley forgot the word. The sign above the porch creaked on its bracket when gusts struck. A pine tree pierced by a crescent moon was painted there, and beneath it the words Pine Hollow Lodge in letters touched up each autumn. In past decades there had been newer names, brighter and more fashionable ones. But the villagers preferred the old Pine Hollow, was what their fathers called it. Pine Hollow was what it had become again. Katrin Weiss, proprietor, cook, barmaid, and occasional village judge, barred the outer door at dusk. She did it briskly and without ceremony. At 50 she was broad in the shoulders from a lifetime of lifting pots and lugging coal. Her grey-streaked hair was twisted into a knot that never quite surrendered to disorder, and her hands were the hands of someone who knows the weight of work and the value of speed. She peered through the glass once more as snow swirled across the yard in furious dance, then slid the bolt home with a decisive clack. "That is that," she said aloud in case the walls doubted her. "We are not letting the mountain decide a thing for us tonight." Her daughter Mara was at the bar wiping cocoa rings from mugs. She was 23, quicker than her mother, slimmer, and full of the quiet focus of someone who has lived among strangers long enough to learn that attention is safer than innocence. Her brown hair was braided tightly down her back. Her eyes were large and steady, and if she had a fault it was only that those eyes listened as much as they looked. She glanced at the door, then at the clock above the mantel. Still no sign of the courier. "The courier is a boy in a tin box on wheels," Katrin replied. "Tonight his tin box will sleep in a ditch. I told him not to try the pass, but boys believe roads are promises." Mara's mouth twitched. "The guests are restless." "They can be restless by the fire, so long as they are inside." The common room was already full in that special way inns are full, when weather has made them the only island left. 8 guests had been gathered not by friendship, but by the storm's decision. Each wore the expression of someone half amused, half unsettled, by being forced into a smaller world than expected, and each had come to Pine Hollow for reasons that, in normal weather, would never have collided. Near the hearth sat Colonel James Harrow, retired English, and still carrying himself like a man who thinks maps should obey him. His mustache was white at the edges, his skin was browned by years in hot countries, and he held his cocoa as if it were brandy in a mess tent. When he spoke in declarations, even about trivial things. Beside him, with her knees tucked neatly to one side, was his niece, Miss Edith Lane. She was 30, dressed with practical care, the kind of woman who has learned to be capable without becoming plain. A notebook lay open on her lap, and she watched people the way she watched landscapes. Quietly, exactly as if she meant to remember what she saw. There was patience in her eyes and a sharpened curiosity behind it. At a table near the window Tomas, Varga played cards with a bright, restless energy that made even waiting feel like a performance. He was Hungarian, lean, and handsome in a way that invited attention, and he used his charm as readily as he dealt. Across from him sat Liselott Dale, a widow traveling alone. She had dark curls pinned into a practical twist and eyes that moved too quickly, as though they feared being caught still. She laughed often and brightly, but it was the laugh of someone determined to prove she was not afraid. Thomas liked making people laugh. Liselott liked not being seen to shake across from them. Beneath the antlers of a stag that had been dead longer than any memory in the room, Felix Brandt sat muttering at the air. He was a businessman from Munich, stout, glossy, and dressed in a coat too expensive for an unplanned night in a village. Every few minutes he drew out a pocket watch, snapped it open, held it close to his ear, as if time might apologize, then snapped it shut again. The movement was too frequent to be habit and too neat to be panic. It was impatience disguised as routine. At the far end, in a chair angled, so he could see everyone without turning his head, Professor Otto Kessler sat with calm amusement. He was tall and thin, safe behind spectacles that slid down his long nose whenever he grew interested. He drank cocoa slowly and smiled to himself at intervals, as if he found the blizzard an elegant practical joke played by nature on human certainty. And nearest the fire, where the light made a halo on her shawl, sat Sister Clara James. She was not a nun but a nurse who had trained in a convent hospital and kept the title out of habit. Her hands were steady and capable, and so were her eyes, though her eyes were not calm. A satchel rested at her feet, and she did not let it stray even inches from her chair. She wore no wedding ring, yet a pale mark on her finger suggested one had not been absent long. At the margins were two more figures, one upstairs with a headache, a middle-aged woman who had retired early, and Herr Rayner, the lodge's coachman, who had come in from the stable only long enough to warm himself. He was perhaps 40, narrow-shouldered, but tough with working muscle, his face weather, creased from years of wind. He wore his dark coat even by the fire, gloves still on, and sat in a corner chair where he could watch the room and the door to the yard. When Catherine spoke to him, he answered with quiet respect. He said little, but listened with the sharp stillness of a man who notices more than he explains. At 7, the wind howled so hard the shutters rattled. Thomas spread his hands theatrically. Well then, my friends, we are prisoners of a very beautiful jail. It is not a jail if you have cocoa, Professor Kessler said dryly. Tell that to my business meeting, Brandt snapped. I was due in Vienna by noon tomorrow. My partners will not accept weather as an excuse. Your partners can take it up with the snow, Liselott said, aiming at lightness and landing too bright. Colonel Harrow stared into his mug. I've been snowed in before. Worst of it is the waiting. Gives people too much time to imagine disaster. Disaster is a form of imagination, Kessler replied serenely. The mind paints it in advance, and sometimes it paints too well. Miss Lane lifted her eyes from her notebook. You philosophers always find comfort in words. Words are all we own when the world refuses to cooperate, he answered, smiling. They talked in this way, circling the storm, circling themselves. There was gossip about avalanches from other years, cheerful complaints about boots, and a small debate over whether the road might be cleared by morning. Every time the wind struck the lodge, silence tightened and then loosened again in laughter that arrived a fraction too quickly. Catherine served stew and black bread, watched her guests eat with brisk satisfaction, then returned to the kitchen to check supplies. She muttered that tourists drink cocoa as if paid by the mug. Mara kept the room warm with refills and quiet jokes. It was then, as the clock pushed toward 8, that the knock came. It was not confident nor timid. It was a knock done with decision and fatigue, like the last tap of a man who has already knocked on every door the storm allowed him to see. Mara stiffened behind the bar. Thomas lowered his cards. Brant looked up sharply. For a heartbeat everyone listened to the wind and wondered if they had imagined the sound. Then it came again, clearer, cutting through the gusts like a small axe. Catherine emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Who in God's name? She went to the door, slid the inner bolt halfway, and peered through the glass. Outside, a small figure stood in the drifted yard, hat pulled low, coat buttoned tight. Snow clung to his shoulders and to the brim of his hat like white flour. He held a valise in one hand and a walking stick in the other. He looked as if he had stepped straight out of a postcard and discovered that postcards are colder than they appear. Catherine drew back the bolt and opened the door. A rush of white air shouldered into the room, sharp with pine and cold metal. The stranger stepped inside, stamping snow from his shoes carefully, as though he disliked disorder even in weather. He removed his hat, shook it once, and bowed with swift exactness. "Madame," he said in a mild, precise voice, "I beg you a refuge. The road is no longer a road." Catherine stared. She was not easily startled, but something about the newcomer's composed dignity in the middle of a blizzard unsettled her in a pleasant way. "Come in, sir. You are half frozen." "I am not half anything," he replied politely, "but I accept warmth with gratitude." He was small, yes, but not frail. His head was egg-shaped, his mustache immaculately trimmed even beneath an onslaught of snow, and his eyes were bright, the color of dark honey. He looked at the room the way a musician looks not only at notes but at the silences between them. Mara was already lifting a mug. "Hot cocoa." "Ah, yes," he said, and his face softened. "Cocoa is a friend one never refuses in winter." Catherine took his valise and passed it to Mara, then guided him toward the hearth. "We had closed the door. You are lucky we heard." "Luck is not a thing I rely on," he said, settling into a chair as naturally as if it had been waiting for him, "but I am grateful to it when it chooses to be kind." He removed his gloves with careful fingers, rubbed his hands once, and held them to the fire. Most people hunch in such moments. This man did not. He sat upright, legs together, coat still buttoned as if to maintain propriety, yet warmth visibly loosened him from the inside. "Your name, sir?" Catherine asked, opening her ledger. He smiled faintly, as if amused by how far a name can travel ahead of its owner. "Hercule Poirot." There was a pause, not the polite pause of introduction, but the sharper kind that follows a name already famous. Professor Kessler's brows rose. Miss Lane's pencil stopped. Colonel Harrow gave a low whistle. Even Brant forgot his watch. "Hercule Poirot," Miss Lane repeated softly. "The same, I fear," Poirot said with mock resignation. "I was promised a quiet retreat. The mountain seems to prefer excitement." Mara set the mug down before him, too trained to stare but unable to hide her widened eyes. "We were not expecting company from the newspapers." "Neither was I expecting a blizzard from heaven," Poirot replied. "We are both surprised." Colonel Harrow leaned forward eagerly. "I've read about you. You solved a case in Cairo with nothing but a cigarette case and a look at a man's shoes." Poirot's mustache twitched. "People exaggerate, Colonel. The shoes were helpful, yes, but the case was ordinary. What mattered was the mind that looked at both." Laughter rose, relieved to have a subject that was not snow. Yet inside the room something shifted. Poirot's arrival added a new warmth to the firelight, curiosity, and a faint unease at being observed by someone famous for noticing what others miss. Poirot did not hurry with questions. He let his eyes travel politely across the room, taking the measure of faces, hands, and small unconscious habits. He saw Brant's watch, checking. He saw Liselotte's darting glances. He saw Thomas's charm working a little too hard. He saw Miss Lane's steady attention, Colonel Harrow's stiff pride, Professor Kessler's amused calm. He noticed Sister Clara's hands tighten subtly at the sound of his name, and the way her satchel seemed to pull her gaze. And he observed Herr Rainer in the corner, who watched Poirot watching him with a narrow, cautious interest. Poirot set his mug down. "You are all traveling for business or pleasure. The mountains are beautiful in winter." "Not when they trap you," Brandt muttered. "You do not like being trapped, Monsieur Brandt." "I have no time for romantic captivity," Brandt snapped, then adjusted his voice. "Forgive me, time is expensive." "Time is expensive for all of us," Poirot said mildly, "but each buys it differently." Miss Lane tilted her head. "And for you, Monsieur Poirot, what buys your time?" Poirot smiled, delighted by the proper shape of the question. "Truth buys my time, sometimes justice, sometimes both." Outside, the wind rose and fell, rehearsing its ghostly lines against shutter and eave. Inside, the guests drew closer to the fire and therefore to one another. Being snowbound turns a room into a mirror. It makes people look at their reflections in strangers' faces and discover they are not always pleased by what they see. Catherine brought out another pot of cocoa and suggested cards. Agreement came quickly. They wanted distraction, company, and the chance not to hear the storm too clearly. Poirot watched their eagerness with a small inward sigh. He had seen too many rooms like this, too many nights where laughter arrived a fraction too fast. The mountain had locked the doors, yes, but now human nature would begin its own work inside. Storms do not invent what people do in shelter. They only strip away the world that hides it. He lifted his mug again, tasting cinnamon and the faint bite of cold still in his throat. "Very well," he said pleasantly. "We shall pass the night, and if the mountain insists on making a theater of our inn, let us hope it does not demand a tragedy." No one answered that. They only laughed, and the laughter was not as steady as it tried to be. Herr Rainer did not laugh at all. He sat still in his corner, eyes narrowed slightly, as if he did not enjoy theater unless he knew the ending. Outside, snow pressed its vast listening face to the windows. It fell with the patience of something that knows time belongs to it. Inside, Pine Hollow Lodge glowed warm and close, full of cocoa conversation, and the uneasy thrill of being cut off. Poirot, small and neat in his chair, watched the flames and listened to the rhythm of voices. He had come by chance, but he knew chance is never only chance. It is often the first page of a story you do not yet know you are in. Chapter 2, The Midnight Sleigh Ride Supper at Pine Hollow Lodge, was less a meal than a small ceremony against the weather. The storm had tightened its grip on the valley, and the lodge in response had tightened its hospitality. Catherine Weiss, whom the guests had already begun calling by the name the village used, Catherine because it suited her brisk authority, served venison stew with dumplings so heavy they could have kept a man upright in any wind. There was black bread that smelled faintly of caraway, and a jar of pickled berries that made everyone's mouths pucker and then smile. Plates were refilled without warning. Empty mugs were replaced before their owners realized they were empty. Nobody could accuse the mountain of starving them. A long table, the guests settled into that temporary intimacy which weather enforces. It was not friendliness exactly. It was the compromise of people who cannot avoid each other, and therefore must decide whether to be civil or miserable. The fire threw warm light across their faces. Outside, the wind yelled at the shutters like a drunk left in the cold, but the thick walls held. Felix Brandt complained about the road with the persistence of a man who believes complaint is a lever. Colonel Harrow contradicted him with military cheer. Thomas Varga turned even the dullness of being trapped into performance, drawing laughter from Miss Lane and even a reluctant snort from the colonel. Liselotte smiled along, her hands wrapped around a mug as if the heat were not only comfort but something she must hoard. Professor Kessler offered a calm remark now and then, letting the others argue like puppies around a low bowl of ideas. Sister Clara James ate quietly, watching without appearing to watch, her satchel tucked close to her leg. Herr Rainer said almost nothing. His eyes moved from speaker to speaker with a steady, unreadable courtesy. Poirot, seated midway down the table, ate neatly, as though even stew must be treated with precision. He listened with the same neatness. He did not dominate the conversation. He allowed himself to become a small, composed presence in the flow. That was how he preferred it at the beginning. Like a watch set quietly in a room, ticking while others forget it is there. It was nearly 10 when the last bowls were cleared. The guests drifted back into the common room, some with the hope of cards, others with the blunt fatigue that comes from fighting a storm for hours. The fire had been built higher. Candles were lit along the main beam. The lodge smelled of pine resin, stew and damp wool. Catherine stood in the doorway from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She watched the room the way a captain watches a ship on a rough sea, gauging whether the crew's mood will hold. "There's a tradition we do," she said suddenly, and her voice carried without needing to be loud. "When winter comes early and locks us in, we go out at midnight for a sleigh ride, under lanterns for good luck before the deep cold settles. My father did it, and his father, it steadies the mind, reminds you that snow is a guest, not a master." There was an instant of silence. Outside the shutters rattled as if the weather itself had heard and wanted to laugh. Felix Brandt's mouth twisted. "In this," he said. "It's a blizzard, not a festival." "It is calmer now," Catherine replied. "The worst passed at dusk. Look." She gestured toward the window, where the snow fell thickly but in slower spirals. "And we do not go far. Only the lower meadow. The horses know the path better than any of us. It is old luck to go at midnight." Colonel Harrow brightened at once. "Splendid idea. Better than sitting about like hens. I haven't been in a sleigh since Norway in '52. Miss Lane looked amused. "Tradition tends to seduce you when you are bored." "I'm not bored," Brandt muttered. But he was. Thomas clapped his hands softly. "A lantern ride in a snow meadow. If this were a novel, I would insist on it." Professor Kessler smiled. "It is a novel for tonight. We are trapped together, therefore. We will manufacture meaning." Liselot's laugh came a fraction too fast. "We'll go," she said quickly, looking at Thomas as though courage were something he could lend by proximity. "Why not?" Sister Clara hesitated. Poirot saw her fingers tighten on the arm of her chair. "You do not wish to go, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. She startled. "Oh, no, it's not that. I am tired, perhaps." "Tiredness passes in fresh air," Catherine said, already warming to the idea. "Come, all of you. It is good for sleep." Herr Rainer lifted his head with mild disinterest. "If the path is safe, I'll come," Brandt grunted. "Fine. Better than sitting here listening to philosophy." Poirot watched the small currents that moved under their words. Boredom, yes, had made fools of everyone, but he suspected there was something else in the agreement too. The storm had locked their bodies in the lodge. The sleigh ride offered a small rebellion, a reassurance that they could still choose something for themselves. It also offered, Poirot noted, a moment of shared darkness and movement, where people might say or do what daylight forbids. Catherine went to harness the sleigh. Mara brought out thick borrowed coats from the storage trunk, insisting on extra scarves and wool hats for those who had arrived ill-prepared. Brandt accepted a rough village coat with visible irritation. Colonel Harrow accepted his with delighted gratitude. The young couple wrapped themselves in one blanket as if it were a romantic costume. Clara took a scarf, but did not let Mara fasten it. She tied it herself quickly, with a knot too tight. At 5 minutes to midnight they stepped into the yard. The cold took their breath with a clean slap. The lodge behind them glowed like a ship's lantern in a white sea. The sky was low and pale, the moon hidden behind cloud, so that the snow had no glitter, only a dim, muffled light. The wind had indeed eased, but it still prowled around the corners with a low, dissatisfied moan. The sleigh waited near the shed, broad and sturdy, its runners iron, its seat piled with hide blankets. 2 horses stood harnessed. The mare old and steady, the gelding younger, flicking his ears at each gust. Their breath rose in clouds like smoke from unseen chimneys. Bells hung from the harness and jingled softly when the horses shifted, giving the night a heartbeat of bright metal. Katrin climbed to the driver's seat, lantern fixed beside her. Another lantern was mounted at the sleigh's rear. The two circles of light made the world beyond them feel even darker. 2 by 2, she called. Sit close. Warmth is not a sin tonight. They climbed in clumsily. Thomas and Liselott sat together, their shoulders pressed. Colonel Harrow took the opposite bench, Miss Lane beside him. Professor Kessler sat across from Brandt. Poirot placed himself at the edge, where he could see both the passengers and the path ahead. Herr Rainer hesitated, then sat near the rear lantern, his face half in light, half not. Sister Clara lingered on the snow for a moment, looking toward the ridge as if listening for something not yet sounded. Poirot noticed she drew her satchel strap tighter over her shoulder before she climbed in. "Are you well, mademoiselle?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said too quickly. "Perfectly." Katrin clicked her tongue. The horses leaned forward, and the sleigh slid out into the meadow with a whisper of runners. The bells brightened into a cheerful jangle. Under their weight, the snow creaked faintly like a floorboard. At once the world changed. The lodge's light fell behind them. The meadow opened wide. A clean sheet stretched between pines. Tree shadows stood long and thin, reaching across the white like fingers. Every sound was softened. Even their own voices seemed delicate in the vast hush. Their breath turned to silver in the lantern glow and then dissolved. "It's like traveling inside a dream," Miss Lane said. "A good dream," Thomas replied, and kissed Liselott's knuckles through her glove. "This is what winter should be," Colonel Harrow declared. "Not city sludge." Brandt made a rude noise. "Winter should be on schedule." Professor Kessler chuckled. "Nature refuses to read your diary, monsieur." Even Brandt smiled in spite of himself. The ride was beautiful and wrong at the same time. Beautiful because the night had wrapped itself around them in a kind of secret tenderness. Wrong because the darkness beyond the lantern circles felt too deep, too listening. Poirot watched faces as much as landscape. He noticed the way Liselott's laughter kept catching against her throat, as if she were moving her lips while something else inside refused to play. He noticed the way Brandt's fingers went to his watch again, even in borrowed gloves. He noticed Rainer's eyes, steady, scanning the tree line when others were looking at snow. He noticed Clara sitting very straight, her scarf pulled so high her breath steamed against it, her hands clasped around the satchel strap, as if she were afraid it might float away. They moved on, following the old path that dipped gently between pines. The horses knew it. Katrin's reins were loose in her hands. The bells kept time. The lanterns made 2 small islands of gold in a sea of white. "Do you do this often?" Poirot asked Katrin. "Only when winter begins like this," she said. "It keeps people from getting frightened by their own heads." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "Yes, the head is very inventive when trapped." She glanced back at him, amused. "You speak like you've been trapped often." "In trains, in houses, in boats," Poirot said lightly. "Wherever humans gather and cannot leave, they reveal themselves." Katrin gave a short laugh. "Let us hope they reveal only harmless things tonight." Poirot let that pass without comment. The path curved toward the lower ridge. Not the dangerous uppercut Katrin had warned about, but a rise where pines thickened and the meadow narrowed. The horses slowed naturally there, their hooves feeling for firmness. The lantern light trembled as the sleigh shifted over a hidden drift. Above them branches sagged with snow, forming a tunnel of black and white. Liselott suddenly drew a breath that sounded like a stifled sob. Thomas glanced at her. "Cold?" "No," she said quickly. "Just the shadows." Thomas laughed softly. "They're only trees, my dear." "Trees can be worse than wolves when you're nervous," Miss Lane said with a calm smile. "I am not nervous," Liselott insisted, and squeezed Thomas's arm so hard his coat bunched. Poirot watched her face. Fear was tucked close to her ribs. Yes, but it was a specific fear, not the general unease of a city woman in a blizzard. It was the fear of someone who expects something to happen because it has already happened before in her mind. Behind Herr Rainer shifted, the lantern caught his profile sharply. He leaned forward slightly as if he wanted to hear better. Poirot noticed that his gloved hand slipped inside his coat for a moment and came out again. A habit, a check, a reassurance. Poirot registered it without naming it. The wind sighed through needles. Snow fell from a branch in a damp thud that made the horses flick their ears. The bells jingled in a brighter, sudden spasm. The sleigh went on. They reached the bend nearest the ridge. The horses slowed again. Catherine murmured to them, low and steady. "Everyone warm enough?" she called. "Yes," Thomas said cheerfully. "Warm enough to regret it later," Professor Kessler replied with mild irony. Laughter fluttered through the sleigh, thin and bright in the hush. It might have warmed them if laughter could do more than cover cold for a second. Poirot, peering ahead, saw a darker seam between trees. It was not movement, just shadow. Yet he felt in the way he had learned to trust that the air had changed. The horses felt it too. The mare's ears flattened, and she shifted sideways with a small snort. The gelding tossed his head. Catherine tightened the reins. "Steady." "What is it?" Miss Lane asked. "Nothing," Catherine said too quickly. "Branches fall in storm, they don't hurt." The mare took 2 hesitant steps and then stopped. Not slowly, but with a bracing halt that jolted the sleigh forward. The bells startled into a frantic jangle. The gelding stamped, blowing hard. The laughter died as if someone had pinched out a candle. Katrine leaned forward. Lantern lifted. Ho, ho there. The mare trembled through her flanks. She was not balking at snow. She was balking at something she could smell or hear. Poirot's senses sharpened. He felt it too, the way silence gathers itself before a sound, the way darkness seems to lean closer. "Turn back," Sister Clara said suddenly, her voice thin. Catherine glanced over her shoulder. "What?" "Turn back," Clara repeated. Her hands were white on her satchel strap. Poirot looked at her keenly. Her fear had grown teeth. Before Catherine could answer, the gelding gave a sharp sideways jerk. The sleigh tipped slightly. Blankets slid. Thomas caught Liselot. Brant swore. The bells shrieked. "Hold on," Catherine snapped, hauling the reins. The horses steadied, snorting, but their panic did not melt. The mare's eyes rolled white under the lantern. Then, from the pines near the ridge, a cry cut through the falling snow. It was high and raw, a sound dragged out of a throat that had no time for words. It rose once, then was swallowed by the night. The horses lunged. The sleigh rocked again. Katrine fought them down, speaking low and fierce. The bells rang like madness. "Did you hear?" Miss Lane began. "A fox," Katrine said quickly, as if the word were a charm. "They scream. It's nothing." But no one believed her. Foxes do not cry like that in human ears, unless the human heart is already expecting horror. Poirot did not speak. He watched faces. Brant had gone grey. Liselot's mouth was open in a silent gasp. Thomas's charm had fallen away completely. Colonel Harrow's eyes were fixed ahead. Hard, Professor Kessler's calm had gone very still. Herr Rainer's gaze was locked on the tree line, sharpened to a blade. And Sister Clara had closed her eyes, as if she had heard the end of a story coming. Catherine turned the horses. The sleigh pivoted with a groan of runners and began to slide back toward the lodge. No one argued. Bells jingled in a frightened rhythm now, less cheerful, more urgent. Snow thickened against their faces. Poirot's heart did not race. His mind did. He knew the shape of this moment too well. The harmless diversion becoming a corridor towards something darker. In such a corridor, people show their true gait. He looked once toward the ridge. In the lantern smear he saw only trees and blowing snow. Yet the cry had been human, of that he was certain. The sleigh hurried homeward through its own track. The inn's glow rose in the distance. Behind that glow, in the white hush of the meadow, something had already shifted. something that would not be smoothed away by laughter or cocoa. Poirot drew his blanket tight around his knees, not because he was cold, but because he was thinking. The midnight sleigh ride had been offered for luck. Luck, Poirot reflected, is often only the name people give to the parts of cause they have not yet understood. And tonight, in the shadows stretched like fingers in the bells that chimed too brightly, and in the fear someone carried like a secret against their ribs, cause had begun to move. Chapter 3. A body beside the tracks. Dawn in the Rosanore Valley did not arrive. It seeped. The storm had thinned during the dark hours into a steady, resentful fall, and the sky now was a pale lid laid on the mountains. The windows of Pine Hollow Lodge were filmed with frost on the inside, as if the cold had tried to enter politely and been refused. Behind that frost the world was only shapes, pines like black strokes, drifts like collapsed clouds, the sleigh track a faint twin line stitched across the meadow. Inside, people woke with the slow reluctance of those who know they have nowhere else to be. The lodge smelled of banked ash and damp wool. Somewhere in the kitchen, a kettle was already beginning to complain. The corridor creaked under careful steps as guests emerged into a morning that felt more like an extension of night. Poirot had been awake for some time. He had slept, because he always slept when he could, but his mind had not been idle. The midnight ride had left him with a residue of unease that he could not scrub away with reason yet. There had been too sharp a cry, too immediate a fear in one voice, too instinctive a panic in the horses. Such things do not always mean tragedy, but they often mean that tragedy was invited. He was in the common room, carefully stirring sugar into coffee that Mara had insisted on making for him, when the shouting began. At first it came through the thick walls like an argument in another building. Then the tone changed, sharpening, lifting, a door banged, feet ran across the porch. Someone cried out a name, high, incredulous. Poirot rose at once. Mara looked at him, her face gone still. "That's my mother's voice," she said. They reached the doorway together. Cold rushed in, and with it 2 village men who had come early to help clear snow from the yard. One of them, thin, red-cheeked, breathless, was half in tears. "Frau Weiss," he babbled. "Down by the sleigh route, there is a man." Katrin Weiss was already pulling on boots in the hall, her hair unbound in a grey twist, her apron forgotten. She stormed past them into the yard without waiting for explanation. The second man followed, muttering a prayer. Poirot took his coat from the peg with neat speed. He did not run. He never ran when thinking was required. But he moved quickly. Behind him he heard doors open, startled voices, the scrape of chairs. The guests were spilling out like bees disturbed in a hive. Outside the snow bit hard. Wind was quieter now, only a low moan among the pines. The yard was full of footprints already, boot marks that had begun to pock the clean surface. Katrin marched ahead toward the meadow, her lamp held high despite daylight. Mara followed close, her shoulders squared. Poirot walked at their rear, watching not only where they went but how the others moved behind him. Felix Brandt was first among the guests, coat half, buttoned, impatience turned to alarm. Colonel Harrow came with his military stride, jaw clenched. Miss Lane kept pace beside him, her notebook forgotten. Thomas Varga had Lieselott's hand in his. She was pale and wide-eyed, her breath visible. Professor Kessler moved more slowly, his face serious now, spectacles fogged. Sister Clara came last, almost stumbling, her scarf tied too quickly, and her satchel slung tight across her body as if she had slept with it on. They crossed the meadow toward the sleigh grooves left by the midnight ride. Those grooves were clean and unmistakable. 2 parallel cuts that curved out from the lodge, dipped among the trees and returned. The path looked deceptively harmless now in daylight, like a child's drawing of winter. Yet halfway along the outward curve the village men stopped. "Here," one whispered. At first Poirot saw only drift. Then the drift's shape resolved itself into the human. Someone lay just off the sleigh line, half covered by fresh snow, as though the mountain had tried to tuck him away. A shoulder, a boot, a pale slice of face. The body was on its side, knees slightly drawn as if in a last unconscious attempt to curl against cold. The snow had settled lightly on hair and coat. It was almost peaceful. But the stillness around it was not peace. It was the silence that chills harder than weather. Catherine gave a sound like a struck bell. She went down on one knee, hands already reaching, then froze. "Don't touch him," Poirot said quietly. His voice carried across the hush without any need to rise. "Not yet." She looked at him, shocked outrage flaring. Then something in his tone steadied her. Her hands hovered and fell back. Poirot stepped forward. He did not kneel at once. He let his eyes take in the tableau as a whole, before any detail seduced him. The man was Theo Reed. They had all known him only briefly, yet the name came to every mouth at once, because the body made it undeniable. Theo Reed, the guest who had retired early with a headache, the one Catherine had said was from America, some kind of writer who had come down after supper only long enough to thank her for the stew, then disappeared upstairs with the exhausted politeness of the unwell. He had not been on the sleigh. That Poirot was sure of. He had counted each face when they climbed in, yet here he was on the sleigh route, as if he had walked out into the storm to meet it, and had never come back. Reed's coat was open. His hands were bare, dark with cold. His hat was gone. No blood showed on the snow. There were no stains on his clothing, only a faint frost at his lips. Poirot knelt. The snow beneath the man had not melted at all. That told Poirot something about the length of time he had lain there. The body was cold as stone. The skin had the slightly waxed pallor of death unhurried. Poirot's gaze moved to the sleigh grooves. The runners had passed within a yard of where Reed lay. If his body had been there at midnight, someone would have seen it, lanterns or no. Therefore, the body had come later. He leaned closer to Reed's face. The eyes were half open, not wide as with terror, but as with surprise that had no time to complete itself. A dead man's mouth can tell a story even when it is silent. Reed's mouth was relaxed. Not a grimace, not a cry frozen in muscle. The death had been swift. Poirot reached, very gently, to touch the inside of one wrist. The gesture was habit, not hope. There was no pulse, of course. But he felt the stiffness, the beginning of rigor. He looked at the fingers. Under the right thumbnail there was a dark fleck. He pinched it free delicately. It was a fiber of wool, reddish-brown. He did not say so aloud yet. Behind him the guests stood as if rooted. Their breaths clouded the air in small, panicked bursts. "He was upstairs," Mara whispered. "He was sick." Brant's voice cracked. "Maybe he got lost, walked out in the night." Colonel Harrow snapped. "A man with a headache doesn't stroll into a blizzard." Professor Kessler murmured, almost to himself, "Unless he was driven by something stronger than a headache." Liselot made a small sound and pressed her face into Thomas's coat. Thomas held her, staring at the body as if his own charm had evaporated with Reed's life. Miss Lane said sharply, "Where is his hat? His gloves?" Poirot looked up at her. "Those are useful questions, mademoiselle." Sister Clara had gone very still. Her hands were at her satchel strap again, knuckles white. Her eyes were fixed not on Reed's face but on the snow near his throat. Poirot noticed that too. He rose slowly. "We must be careful where we stand," he said. "The snow is a record. If we trample it, we destroy our only witness." Catherine, breathing hard, nodded. "What do we do?" "We look," Poirot replied calmly. "Before we move him, we look at everything." He turned to the ground around the body. There were footprints, yes, but not in the way a simple discovery makes them. A few steps approached from the direction of the lodge. Those belonged to the village men who had found him. Their edges were sharp, made within the last hour. Poirot ignored those and searched for older impressions. There were others, 2 sets at least, one heavier, with deep heels and a confident stride, one lighter, shorter, the sort a smaller person would make. They circled once around the body in a way that suggested examination, not panic. Then the lighter print stopped in a clean patch of snow where no feet continued, stopped as if the person had vanished. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He moved to the end of the light prints and crouched. The snow there was smooth, yes, but faintly pressed. Not cut by boot, but flattened as if something broad had slid across it. A board, perhaps, a hide, a small sled. A man does not vanish from the earth. He vanishes from a story only when the storyteller edits. Poirot lifted his head and followed the heavier prints. They led away from Reed's body toward the pines at the ridge, but only for a dozen paces, then merged into the sleigh groove and were lost among other disturbances. That told him something too. The person had used the sleigh track as a road to move without leaving new traces. He straightened and walked slowly along the sleigh groove itself. Beside it, at irregular intervals, were marks he did not like. Boot prints again, but spaced wrongly, too short a stride in one place, too long in another, toes sometimes pointing toward the lodge, sometimes away. The pattern was not that of a man walking forward at ease. It was the pattern of someone stepping backward while hauling something heavy, or shuffling sideways to keep an eye on what lay behind him. Poirot stopped where one heel had bitten deep, toe barely touching. It was the mark of a body leaning back under strain. He returned to the group. "Theo Reed did not fall and die here by chance," he said quietly. Catherine shut her eyes once, as if the words were a blow. Mara's hand rose to her mouth. Brant swallowed. Colonel Harrow's face hardened into a soldier's anger. Professor Kessler's gaze sharpened, almost eager despite grief. Miss Lane drew a breath, steadying herself. Thomas looked down toward Liselotte's bowed head. Sister Clara's throat worked as she swallowed. "Then he was murdered," Mara whispered. Yes, a silence fell. The storm, for all its noise, could not compete with that kind of silence. Brant burst out, "But how? There's no blood." Poirot scanned the body once more. Not every murder needs blood. Sometimes death is neat. Colonel Harrow muttered, "Poison, you mean?" Poirot neither confirmed nor denied. "We shall say only this. The method was swift and it required proximity." Miss Lane said softly, "But he wasn't on the sleigh. When would someone have had proximity?" "A good question," Poirot said. "We will answer it by understanding his night." Catherine's voice trembled with fury now, not fear. "Who would do this under my roof?" Poirot looked at her with grave sympathy. "Madame, the roof does not make saints. It only keeps out snow." He turned to the guests. "Each of you will return to the lodge. You will not go to your rooms alone, unless you tell my friend Mara first. You will not touch Mr. Reed's belongings. You will not leave the building. We are cut off, so we must act with intelligence, not panic." Brant started to protest, then caught himself. Colonel Harrow nodded sharply, already thinking in terms of command. Miss Lane's eyes stayed on Poirot, as if she might anchor herself there. Thomas helped Liselotte toward the lodge, murmuring something into her hair. Professor Kessler walked last, his mind already turning. Sister Clara hung back a fraction, staring at Reed once more, with an expression Poirot could not yet name. When they were gone, Poirot spoke to the village men. "We will carry him in," he said. "But carefully. Note everything. The position, the direction of prints. We will need memory where the snow will soon be blank." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher. As they lifted the body, a loose fold of Reed's coat fell open, and something glinted briefly in the morning light. Poirot saw it and reached at once. A small brass button torn from a garment. The cloth still attached was fine wool, dyed a reddish brown. He slipped it into his pocket without comment. Back at the lodge, the common room had transformed from a refuge into a courtroom that did not yet know its judge. The fire crackled, cocoa steamed untouched. Everybody stood too close together, then pulled apart again, as if proximity had turned dangerous. Poirot removed his hat and addressed them calmly. "You are all aware now that a murder has been committed. We cannot send for the police until the pass is cleared. That may be hours. It may be a day. Therefore, we must keep order ourselves. "This is not a time for private quarrels or secret walks. It is a time for truth," Professor Kessler said softly. "Truth is difficult in a blizzard." Poirot met his eye. "That is why the snow helps. It does not lie, people do." Brant flinched at the bluntness. Liselott lifted her head, eyes glassy. Colonel Harrow's jaw tightened. Miss Lane stood very still, absorbing each word. Catherine hovered at the doorway to the side room where Reed had been placed. Her face like iron held too close to fire. Poirot continued, "We will speak in turn. Each of you will tell me precisely where you were from the moment the sleigh returned to this lodge until you slept. You will tell me what you saw, what you heard, and what you did. Do not guess. Do not decorate. The small, dull details are often more important than the dramatic ones." He paused a moment, letting the weight settle. "The mountain may hide a body in a drift," he said quietly, "but it cannot hide a guilty mind in a room. We will find the truth here." Outside, the snow kept falling in patient silence, already beginning to soften the sharp edges of footprints that had shouted their strange story in the dawn. Inside, under the low beams of Pine Hollow Lodge, the true storm was only beginning. Chapter 4. The snow writes its own witness. By late morning, the lodge had settled into a hush that was not peace, but strain. The storm had turned Pine Hollow Lodge into a sealed globe. Shake it, and the same faces drift past your eyes again and again. The telephone lines were dead. The pass road a white blur, and old Herr Vogel, the village constable, had sent word on skis that he could not reach the inn until a plough arrived. As ploughs do not sprout legs, no one expected him soon. So, without being asked, the guests began to look to the small, neat stranger in the borrowed coat. Poirot did not announce that he was in charge. He never needed to. Authority is not noise. It is the calm certainty that makes frightened people want to stand near it. He spoke quietly, listened carefully, and responsibility flowed toward him like water finding a channel. "We will remain in the common room for the present," he said. "Not because I confine you like children, but because confusion is a friend to the murderer." Felix Brant bristled. "This is an inn, not a prison. I do not lock you," Poirot replied mildly. "The mountain does. I merely prevent you from lending it a key." Colonel Harrow, who understood command, said sharply, "He's right. We keep order or we lose it." Brant subsided, muttering into his watch. Poirot added, "Each of you will speak to me in turn about last night. But first I must read the snow again, while it still remembers Mara. You will keep everyone here. If anyone goes upstairs or outside, you tell me." Mara nodded, chin high. "They won't." Poirot believed her. Yet belief is not a substitute for caution. He took his hat and cane and stepped into the yard. The cold closed around him cleanly. Snow fell in a steady drift that already began to soften edges. He walked along the sleigh groove, placing his boots where older prints lay, reading as he went. The sleigh track was the spine of events, the footprints the margins where the secret always hides. At the place where the horses had balked, the snow was scarred by last night's scramble, yet even chaos has grammar. Poirot crouched beneath a pine whose branches had shielded the crust and found the clearest marks. 2 sets of prints led away from the sleigh on the ridge side. The first was heavy, deep at heel, with toes turned slightly outward and a long, confident stride. Whoever made it did not run. He walked with decision into the trees. The second set was lighter, shorter, following close, sometimes stepping in the same holes, sometimes beside them. 2 people had gone together. Poirot followed until drift smudged the trail, then returned to the sleigh stop. There he found the heavier prints coming back alone. The stride was steady and unhurried, yet the left heel sank a shade deeper than the right, as if the bearer carried weight on one side or favored a knee. Small differences in snow are rarely small in life. The lighter prints did not return at all. Then there was the third story. Beside the inward sleigh groove halfway home, a small set of careful steps appeared where no steps ought to begin. Their stride was short, their heel shallow, their toes neat and straight. They did not branch from the sleigh or from the lodge. They started abruptly on clean snow, like a sentence begun mid-thought. They ran beside the groove for 30 paces, then veered toward the spot where Theo Reed had been found. Near that place they circled once, as if someone examined the body. And then they ended. Poirot knelt at the end of the trail. The snow there was faintly pressed, not cut by boot, but flattened in a broad, shallow sweep. Something had slid across it, a board, a hide, a small sled. Again the same impossible vanishing the dawn had shown. He looked up. A low branch above bore a fresh scrape, bark exposed. Under it a straight, narrow groove ran a foot or two before disappearing under drift. It was consistent with a flat surface dragged under the branch, then lifted away. Reed had not walked here from the lodge. There were no prints to prove it. Reed had not been carried far. The snow showed no staggering deep heel rhythm. Reed had been moved by a method designed to leave as little trace as possible, and that method required at least 2 people. 2 people went into the trees. One came back. A smaller walker appeared later, went to Reed, and left without using feet. The snow was not describing accident. It was describing design. He walked a little farther toward the ridge where the cry had sounded. The wind had blown a shallow bowl there, and at the bowl's lip he found a single deep stamp that was not made in the panic of the sleigh. The toe pointed toward the trees, the heel braced toward the track, the stance wide. It was the mark of a man who pulled something toward himself. Beside it, fainter, were 2 quick half steps, as if another person shifted to make room. Poirot did not pretend the snow gave him a full portrait. It gave him gestures, and gestures are often enough. He let his eyes move over the whole meadow. There were no stray wanderings, no lost loops that would belong to a confused victim. Everything went where it meant to go. The storm had not created disorder here. It had only tried, too late, to cover order with a fresh white sheet that told him motive as surely as method. Whoever acted last night had time to think, and wanted the world to see a story that was not the true one. In his mind he placed the people as they had sat in the sleigh. He recalled the brief lantern flare on faces at the ridge, Brandt's sudden grayness, Harrow's anger, Kessler's stillness, Miss Lane's quick, steady glance, Thomas pulling Liselott close, Rayner leaning forward like a man who expects a signal, Clara's thin, urgent turn back. The snow spoke of feet, but the night had spoken of hearts. The 2 languages must meet. Poirot's gaze returned to the small, vanished trail. If a person had left without returning by foot, there were only a few sensible ways. They could have boarded the sleigh unnoticed. They could have been carried, or they could have used a small sliding surface. The sleigh itself had returned full. No one had noticed an extra body carrying would have scarred the surface. Therefore sliding remained, and sliding required preparation. One does not improvise a board in a blizzard. One brings it or hides it, or knows where one can find it without being seen. A village child will keep a sled behind a barn. A lodge worker will know where spare hides are stored. A traveler will not. This, too, was a clue, and it pointed not yet to a name but to a category. Someone with access, someone slight enough to leave those short steps, someone clever enough to think a storm could be an accomplice. He rose at last, brushed snow from his knees, and turned back to the lodge with the slow certainty of a man carrying delicate knowledge. Poirot stood, letting his mind test the possibilities without indulging the absurd. He pictured the boots in the lodge, Liselott's narrow pair, Mara's surprisingly small village boots, Miss Lane's sturdy tread, Clara's practical soles, Harrow's heavy military heel, Brandt's polished city leather, Kessler's long stride, Rayner's cautious step. The snow reads souls, not souls. A murderer can change souls. He returned to the lodge, the bright windows offending him with their domestic innocence. Inside, the common room felt smaller. People had arranged themselves into uneasy positions as if furniture could protect them from suspicion. Brandt stood by the window, watch in hand. Harrow sat like a tribunal. Miss Lane had placed herself where she could see everyone. Thomas held Liselott near the hearth. Kessler Lean stood by the bookshelf, thoughtful. Clara sat upright, satchel tight to her ankle. Rayner watched from his corner with polite impatience. Mara came forward at once. "What did you find?" "Many things," Poirot said quietly. "Some of them are lies dressed as truth." He let the silence sit for a moment, watching how each person carried it, some like a shield, some like a weight, one or two like a secret in the pocket. Fear had made them attentive, attentiveness, if guided, could make them honest. For the guilty, quiet is discomfort. He turned to the room. "Before we speak again, I require something simple." "Your boots," a murmur rose. "Yes, your boots," he repeated gently. "Bring them here. The snow has described your feet to me. I wish to know whether it described you or someone wearing you." Reluctantly they fetched them and set them on the floorboards in a grim parade. Poirot examined each sole against the patterns he had read outside. He touched nothing in anger, only in precision. When he set down the last pair, he looked up. "The snow is telling a tale someone hoped the storm would erase," he said. "Two people went into the trees. One returned alone. A third walker appeared later, slight and cautious, and vanished without returning by foot. This is not a natural story. It is a constructed one." Brant made a choking noise. "So you know who?" "I know what the snow says," Poirot replied. "Now I must learn why it says it, so we begin." He chose his first witness not by rank but by nerve, and his eyes settled on Sister Clara. "Mademoiselle James," he said softly, "on the sleigh you were more frightened than the others. Why?" Clara lifted her head as if pulled by a string. Her face was pale, yet her voice was trained steady. "I was frightened," she said, "because I heard the cry and knew it was not an animal." "And why did you know?" Her eyes flicked toward the side room where Theo Reed lay under a sheet. "Because I have heard men cry before they die." The room went still. Poirot nodded. "Then we will begin there," he said. "Tell me everything you did after the sleigh returned." Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints as it always does inside. Poirot prepared to make the human mind speak as plainly as winter. Chapter 5. 8 guests. 8 shadows. The parlor of Pine Hollow Lodge had never been intended for trials. It was a room built for winter civility, a broad hearth that carried the scent of old pine in its stones, velvet chairs whose arms had been polished by generations of anxious hands, and lamps with yellow shades that turned every face tender if one did not look too closely. Now, under that same softened light, the chairs had been drawn into a rough semicircle, and the hearth, still warm, still cracking faintly, felt less like comfort than like a witness who could not speak. Outside, the snow continued its patient work, smoothing the world into silence. Inside, the silence worked differently. It sharpened. Poirot stood near the mantel, not in the center, but just off it. He never placed himself as a judge. Might place himself, he preferred to be a conductor, present enough to guide, small enough to make others forget how closely they were being observed. His cane rested against his leg. His hands were folded with that neatness which, in him, was not affectation but method. He had asked for mugs of hot tea, not cocoa. Cocoa invites indulgence, tea invites conversation. Mara moved among the guests, setting cups on tables, glancing at Poirot for quiet instruction. Catherine Weiss, Catherine to the village, but still Catherine to those who had already adopted her sterner name, sat nearest the hearth with her back straight, hands around her mug, as if it were an implement she might be required to use. The tiredness in her eyes was deep and practical. She had been awake since before dawn, feeding mouths, and then guarding a dead one. Her steadiness had the hard edge of a woman who has had to be steady for others too long to permit herself a collapse now. Poirot let his gaze pass over each person in turn. It was the same gesture he had made in trains, in drawing rooms, in hotels, in condemned houses, a slow, polite sweep of the room that was also a taking of inventory. Sister Clara James sat slightly apart, the angle of her chair suggesting both professionalism and caution. She was in her late 30s, with a doctor's calm in the set of her shoulders and a physician's restlessness in her fingers. Her voice, when she had spoken earlier, had been steady as a metronome. Yet Poirot had heard it crack once, softly when he thought no one listened. Doctors are trained to make their fear useful. Sometimes they forget to hide it. Miss Edith Lane had chosen a seat close to a lamp as if she mistrusted the shadows. She was a travel writer, she had said. Her notebook lay open on her lap even now, though she was not writing. Her curiosity was visible in her posture, the slight lean forward, the alert tilt of her head, and her sleeplessness was visible too, in the faint bruising under her eyes. She looked at the parlor not like a prisoner, but like a person who suspects she has been delivered a story too important to miss. Colonel James Harrow, retired soldier, sat with the exact posture of a man who has spent half his life being corrected by sergeants. His hair was close, cropped, his jaw clean, shaven, his hands on his knees. There was a controlled emptiness in his expression, the dull joy of a man who has survived enough to stop expecting pleasure. He nodded to Poirot once, with the grave courtesy of one professional recognizing another. Liselott Dale, the widow, had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and arranged her hands on her mug in a way that made her look gentle. Her smiles came softly, and at the right moments, the way a practiced hostess moves through grief without letting anyone else trip over it. Yet there was something in her stillness that sounded like iron under velvet. Harder history, Poirot had already thought. History that knew how to walk quietly. Felix Brandt, businessman, could not sit still. Even in a lodge chair he managed to look as if he were perched on the edge of a meeting table. He laughed too loudly when someone looked at him, and he sipped his tea as if it were an insult. His clothes were good, but worn in the right places for a man who wants to look prosperous even when the seams are thinning. Loud laugh, quiet debts. Poirot had heard the phrase in Mara's observation and found it accurate. Herr Rayner, the coachman, stood near the wall rather than sit. He was the only one who did not look like a guest. He had the strong hands and cracked knuckles of a man who lives outdoors. His skin browned by wind. Loyalty to the sleigh was written all over him in the way he watched the door whenever the horses shifted outside. Loyalty to secrets was written too, in his habit of choosing his words as if each one cost him something. 7 people besides Poirot, 8 guests, 8 shadows. Each shadow, Poirot knew, was made not only by a body but by the angle of the light. Change the light, and the shadow changes shape. He spoke at last, softly enough that they leaned in. Mesdames, messieurs, we are in an unfortunate position. One man is dead. The road is closed. The constable is not here. Therefore, we must be wise. Wisdom begins with truth. Felix Brandt opened his mouth, but Poirot lifted a finger. You will speak when I ask, monsieur. For now, you will listen. I will not accuse. I will only understand the murderer is among us, and he will be found not by loud suspicion, but by small certainty. A faint shiver moved through the semicircle. Miss Edith Lane's pen tightened in her fingers. Colonel James Harrow's eyes narrowed. Liselott Dale took a slow breath. Sister Clara James stared at her own hands as if they might reveal a tremor. Poirot turned slightly toward Catherine Weiss. Madame, he said gently, you know your lodge better than any of us. Tell me first what happened after supper. Not your thoughts, only what you saw. Catherine's voice was low and even, as if she were reporting a kitchen inventory. After supper I cleared the table with Mara. Rayner brought the sleigh round as usual. I offered the ride. People agreed. We left just before midnight. Did you see Mr. Reed then? Number he hadn't come down since he said good night. He told me his head was hurting. I sent him a little chamomile tea upstairs. Mara took it. Poirot inclined his head toward Mara, who nodded silently from the doorway. Continue, please. Catherine's hands tightened around her mug. We made the loop to the lower ridge. The horses balked. There was that cry. I turned them and brought everyone back. I counted heads at the door. Everyone was there. Everyone who had gone out, Poirot said. Yes. Poirot nodded. He did not ask yet whether she had counted correctly. People always believe they have. He turned to Herr Rainer. Herr Rainer, you were with the sleigh earlier. Yes, you harnessed the horses. Rainer cleared his throat. I do it every ride. Tell me about the horses last night. They were steady till the ridge bend. Then the mare stopped hard. She don't do that unless she's spooked proper. I thought maybe a branch down. When the cry came, the gelding jumped. I held him after we got back. Did you go out again after the sleigh returned? Rainer's eyes flicked once to Catherine, then back. No, sir. Poirot's tone stayed kind. You remained in the stable? A while. Then I came in. The guests were in the parlor. I had a drink of tea, went to bed about 1 and a bit. Poirot accepted that without comment. Yet he marked the flicker to Catherine. Loyalty in a man like Rainer is not always to truth. Sometimes it is to the person who pays him. He looked to Miss Edith Lane. Miss Lane, you are a writer. Writers notice what others miss. Tell me what you remember after the sleigh returned. Edith tried to smile and failed. We came in. Everyone was excited, rattled. Mr. Brandt told a joke about foxes, I remember, because it was awful. Felix Brandt made an indignant sound. Edith ignored it. I sat in the parlor with Liselotte and Clara for maybe half an hour. Colonel James Harrow was there too. We talked about the roads clearing. I drank tea, then went upstairs. I couldn't sleep. I heard the wind and the stable bells once or twice. I must have dozed around too. Poirot asked softly. Did you leave your room? Edith's chin lifted. Number, you are certain. Yes. He let that sit. People who write for a living are practiced at certainty. Sometimes it is real, sometimes it is style. He turned to Colonel James Harrow. Monsieur Harrow, you were on the sleigh. Tell me where you were between our return and your sleep. Harrow spoke like a man giving coordinates. Back at the lodge, I helped Catherine unharness the mare. Then I came in. I stayed in the parlor with the others. I went upstairs at 1. I was asleep before 1:30. Did you see anyone leave the parlor? Harrow considered. Number, we were all there. I would have noticed. Poirot's gaze rested on him a second longer than was polite. Soldiers notice movement. But soldiers can also be taught to look away. He faced Sister Clara James. Sister Clara James. Clara looked up quickly. Yes, your account. Clara's voice was calm, though Poirot heard the strain under it. After we got back, I checked on Mrs. Dale. She said she was fine, only shaken. Then I sat in the parlor. I suggested we all keep together because people do foolish things when they're frightened. Around 12:30 I went upstairs to make sure Mr. Reed was all right. He didn't answer when I knocked. I assumed he was asleep. I didn't go in. Poirot's eyes sharpened. You went upstairs alone, yes. Did anyone see you go? Clara hesitated. I don't know. I didn't think to announce it. Poirot nodded gently. Did you go again later? Numbered. Did you hear anything in the corridor? Only the wind. I may have heard a door close somewhere. Nothing clear. Poirot said quietly. Thank you. He turned to Liselotte Dale. Madame Dale, you are a widow. Forgive me if I am blunt. Grief makes one observant in certain ways. Tell me your night. Liselotte's soft smile appeared like a curtain drawn by habit. After the sleigh ride I was shivering, so I sat at the fire. Edith and the doctor were kind enough to keep me company. Brandt was talking rather too much. James was listening rather too little. She glanced at Harrow with a mild kindness that did not invite reply. I went to bed at 1. I slept badly. I woke once to use the washroom. That was around 3, I think. Poirot asked. Did you see anyone awake then? Liselotte lowered her eyes. I thought I heard footsteps below, not loud. Perhaps Rainer coming in from the stable. I didn't look. Poirot filed that away. A widow who has survived a hard history may refuse to look because she has already seen too much, or because she does not want to be caught looking. He finally faced Felix Brandt. Monsieur Brandt. Brandt spread his hands with a theatrical shrug. Same as everyone. We came back, we had tea, we talked, we went to bed. Poirot tilted his head. Detail, please. Brandt laughed too loud. All right, all right. After we got in, I poured myself tea. I told that fox joke, sorry, Edith, we sat by the fire. I was in the parlor the whole time. I went upstairs last around 1:30. I didn't go out again. I didn't go into anyone's room, my head was spinning from the cold. That's all. His laugh tried again and died. Poirot watched the way his eyes slid toward the window. Loud men often look toward exits when they lie. Poirot let a pause grow long enough to make everyone feel its shape. The lamps hissed faintly. Somewhere in the stable a horse stamped, bells chiming softly, as if remembering last night's panic with embarrassment. Thank you, Poirot said at last. You all say you stay together. Togetherness is a blanket. Yes, it keeps one warm, but it also hides plenty, Brandt snapped. Are you saying we're lying? Poirot looked at him mildly. I am saying that people can be sincere and still be wrong. When you speak of together, you mean in the parlor. But there are corridors, there are stairways, there are moments when someone rises to fetch a shawl, to use a washroom, to breathe by a window. A minute is long enough to kill if the killer has prepared. Edith's pen scratched once, then stopped. Clara's jaw tightened. Liselott Dale's fingers went still on her mug. Colonel James Harrow stared ahead, as if waiting for orders. Herr Rayner's shoulders curved slightly inward. Catherine Weiss's tired eyes sharpened with something close to fury. Felix Brandt swallowed. Mara stood very straight by the doorway. Poirot continued, voice even. The snow tells me that 2 people left the sleigh at the ridge. Only 1 returned by foot. Later, a smaller person approached the place where Mr. Reed was found and left without walking back. That is what the snow says. It is not a guess. It is a record. A current ran through the room like cold through a cracked pane. But we didn't leave the sleigh, Catherine said. Poirot met her gaze. Summonen did, madam, perhaps without your seeing. Perhaps when the horses jolted. Perhaps in that instant of confusion the night is so generous at providing. But there was no room, Edith murmured. We were packed in. Poirot nodded. Just so, therefore, whoever left did so quickly in darkness, when everyone looked at something else. Clara's calm voice cracked now, as Poirot had heard it crack before. If that's true, then one of us killed him out there. Poirot did not soften the truth for them. He never had. Yes. Silence swelled, not frightened now but thoughtful, because fear had finally found a shape to cling to. Poirot stepped closer to the semicircle, still not in the center, but near enough that they could feel his attention like warmth or like fire. We will go again through the night, he said, not to repeat lies, but to find the corners where memory fails. I will ask you about small things, the position of bodies in the sleigh, the words spoken after the cry, the order in which you entered the lodge, who had wet boots, who changed scarves, who went upstairs first. Small things, yes, like grains of salt, but it is the small things that make a dish true. He rested his hands on the mantel edge. His voice grew gentler, not in comfort but in precision. I tell you also this, the murderer is clever, but not clever enough to silence the snow. He believed the storm would erase his witness. Instead it preserved it for me. Now I will do the rest. He looked around once more. 8 guests, 8 shadows. The lamps made each shadow long and uncertain on the wall behind its owner. Some shadows trembled as their owners did. Some stayed quite still. Poirot saw, in that stillness, not only fear but calculation, and he knew the next hours would not be about searching the meadow. They would be about searching the mind. Now, he said softly, we begin again. This time do not tell me where you were together. Tell me where you were alone. Chapter 6, Lantern Light and Old Grudges. The lodge had learned a new sound, the sound of people trying not to speak. It was not silence exactly, but an economy of noise. Cups set down too softly, Chairs moved without scrape. Footsteps that paused in doorways as if asking permission to exist. Even the fire seemed to burn with a kind of discretion, as though flames could be accused of listening. Poirot did not hurry the morning. He understood that if you push too hard, truth retreats into performance. So he drank his tea slowly, letting warmth reach his hands, and the rhythm of Pine Hollow returned to something that resembled ordinary life. Ordinary life, even for the guilty, is a habit that asserts itself. People must talk. They must explain themselves. They must be seen to be calm. Katrine Weiss moved through the common room with the practicing composure of a woman forced to host disaster. She directed Mara to keep kettles coming and bread on the sideboard, as if hunger were a sensible thing after discovering death. Her tired eyes had the fixed brightness of someone who has been awake since before dawn, and her hands were steady because she had never been allowed to let them tremble in front of strangers. Sister Clara James lingered near the bar. She looked calm when anyone watched her. When they did not, her jaw clenched and unclenched as if she were chewing something too bitter to swallow. Nurses are trained to make fear useful. It is harder to make it invisible. Miss Edith Lane sat by a lamp with her notebook open. She was not writing, not yet. Only turning pages she had filled on other journeys, other inns, other harmless stories of weather and charm. Her curiosity remained visible in the small lean forward of her body, and her sleeplessness in the faint shadows under her eyes. She had come to write about winter, and found herself inside something older. Colonel James Harrow had taken the posture of a sentry. He remained near a window, not because he expected rescue, but because vigilance is a kind of faith to men trained in war. His quietness was not gentle, it was armor. Liselotte Dale sat by the hearth with a shawl about her shoulders, soft smile in place. Yet Poirot noticed the way she watched Catherine when she believed no one observed her. An old wary attention, like someone who has learned that kindness is not always safe. Felix Brandt moved restlessly, making jokes that died when they landed. A loud laugh is sometimes not joy, but a bell a man rings to prove he is not afraid of ghosts. Herr Rayner disappeared to the stable more often than sense required. Each time he returned, snow clung to his boots and his face was red with cold. It is easier to breathe among horses when your mind is troubled. Poirot waited until noon had dulled the frantic edge of morning into something more manageable. Then he spoke in a voice so natural that it felt like the continuation of a conversation no one remembered beginning. "Miss Lane, you said you were unable to sleep." Edith looked up, startled by the ordinariness of his tone. "Yes, I don't sleep well anywhere new." "Then you heard what others did not." "After 1 o'clock, what did you hear?" She frowned, listening backward. "The wind, mostly. But around 2 I heard a door close. Not a slam, a careful click. I assumed someone went to the washroom. Above or below? I couldn't tell. It was muffled." Poirot nodded. "And the sleigh bells?" She hesitated. "Once, a little jingle. It struck me because the bells were still on. Rayner hadn't taken the harness off right away." Poirot turned his gaze to Rayner. "When did you remove them?" Rayner planted his hands on a chair back as if he needed something solid. "Not till the gelding cooled 10 minutes, maybe more. I took the harness off slow. The mare was breathing hard. So the bells rang for some time after we returned." "Aye. And you say one was cut?" Rayner reached into his coat and produced a small leather strap with a bell missing from it. "This is what I found this morning. The left front string, clean snipped. Not torn, not broke." Felix Brandt blurted, "Why cut a bell?" "Because bells tell you where the sleigh is," Poirot said quietly. "If you wish to move unseen near a horse, you silence what jingles." The thought settled grimly in the room. Each person imagined last night again. The lanterns, the panic, the moment when attention broke like a wave. A bell cut before the ride would make the sleigh quieter at the very time someone might wish to slip away. Madame Mr. Reed. Theo Reed was not a stranger to this lodge. Catherine's shoulders stiffened. Number not a stranger. He used to own it. Edith's eyes widened. He owned Pine Hollow. Catherine's mouth tightened the way a bruise tightens when pressed. 10 years ago, it was his hunting house turned inn. He sold it to me suddenly. Cheap, no warning. And why? He said he was leaving the mountains, said he'd had enough. But folk in Rosenau knew better than to ask too much. They only hoped he'd go and not come back. Poirot's voice remained gentle. People here lost because of his sale. Catherine stared into her tea a moment before answering. He had plans, a bigger lodge, a road extension. He convinced villagers to invest timber rights, savings, even bits of land. Then he sold, left, and the plans died. Some lost everything. Liselot Dale murmured softly, "My husband invested. He believed in Theo." Poirot looked at her. "Belief is a powerful currency, madame, and a dangerous one." She did not deny it. Her soft smile held steady, yet something older looked out from behind it. Poirot turned to Sister Clara James. "Doctor, did you know Mr. Reed before yesterday?" Clara blinked. "Number, I'm here on holiday. I've never even been to Rosenau. But you carry medicines. I examined your bag this morning. 1 vial is missing." The room tightened in an instant. Clara's calm cracked in plain sight. "Missing, that's impossible. I didn't use anything." "You told me you keep an emergency sedative for severe agitation," Poirot said. "It is no longer there." Clara flushed, then went pale again. "Somebody must have stolen it." "Your bag was unattended." "Only for a moment. I went upstairs at 12:30 to check on Reed. The bag was in the parlor. Everyone was here." Poirot's eyes were kind but unblinking. Togetherness is a blanket. It hides plenty. Clara swallowed hard. He knew it was true. A minute is long enough to take a vial. It is also long enough to do worse. Poirot rose. "I will step outside once more." No one objected. It was easier to let him leave than to answer. The cold met him at the door, clean and sharp. He walked alone along the sleigh groove, Kane placing careful steps in older marks. Snow had softened the edges since morning, yet the right places still held memory. Where Theo Reed had been found, discovery footprints had churned much of the surface. Poirot knelt at the pine root where drift had settled thickest and brushed gently with the whisk broom Mara had lent him. Something dark emerged against white, a scrap of leather glove, torn and stiff with cold, tucked under the root as if a panicked hand had shoved it there without thinking. The leather was fine, city quality. The torn edge was ragged, not cut but ripped. There was no blood. There was resin smeared on one fold, suggesting a hard press against bark. Poirot lifted it delicately into a handkerchief. He followed again the strange bracing prints beside the sleigh groove. In one place a heel dug deep, toe barely touching, the mark of pulling. Near it a short skitter line ran straight for a foot or two, then vanished under drift, as if something flat had been tugged briefly, lifted, then carried again. A small sled, a board, a hide. The snow was repeating the same phrase in a different dialect. He returned to the lodge carrying the glove scrap like a sealed letter. When he entered, conversation died at once. He placed the fragment on the table. "Near the death site," he said quietly. "A torn piece of glove. City leather. It was forced off, not dropped." Felix Brandt leaned forward. "Whose glove?" Poirot looked at hands and at the gloves now worn for warmth. "Not Rayner's, not the doctor's, not the innkeeper's." "Then it was Theo's," Edith whispered. "Possibly," Poirot agreed. "Or possibly the one who was with him." Clara asked hoarsely, "If the sedative was used, what would it do?" Poirot turned back to him. "Tell us." Clara answered with professional steadiness regained by effort. "A measured dose can render someone sleepy, uncoordinated, even unconscious. Too much can slow breathing dangerously. It can be injected without much notice." Poirot nodded. He did not say aloud what every mind now formed. A neat death without blood, a swift stillness, a missing sedative, a glove ripped near a pine root where someone had knelt close to a victim. Instead, he spoke of motive. "Mr. Reed's past is now in this room," he said softly. "Someone here lost because he sold the lodge. Old grudges do not freeze, they only wait." Liselot Dale's voice was gentle. "Hate is a strong word." "Strong words are sometimes accurate," Poirot replied. Herr Rayner shifted, jaw tightened. "He had no right to come back," he muttered. "No right to walk in like he owned Pine Hollow still." There was the first open flare of resentment. Catherine's tired eyes flashed in warning, but Poirot had already heard. Loyalty and anger, he knew, often share a harness. Poirot stepped back from the table. "Three things are clear. First, Reed had history here, and history makes motives. Second, someone silenced the sleigh bells, expecting movement in darkness. Third, a sedative is missing, and a glove was torn where the body lay. These are not separate accidents. They are notes in one music." He looked at them one by one, giving each face the courtesy of attention and the weight of suspicion. "Tonight we will reconstruct the sleigh ride here in the parlor," he said. "Not for drama, but for memory. We will place each person as they sat. We will repeat the words spoken, the gestures made. We will test who could have slipped away when the horses jolted, who would not have noticed, and who needed the bells silent." No one spoke. They were all listening now, not to perform but to survive. Outside, the blizzard kept chanting its slow, hungry hymn against the shutters, patient as time itself. Inside, lantern light warmed old grudges into sharper edges, and Poirot prepared to pull the last dark ribbon of Theo Reed's past, until it led cleanly to the hand that ended his present. Chapter 7. The trick of the tracks the afternoon drew on with that peculiar heaviness which comes when a storm has stolen the horizon. The light outside was flat and colorless, a kind of daylight that makes even the living look slightly unreal. Inside, however, the parlor had been coaxed into a more intimate glow. Lamps were lit early, their yellow circles pushing back the gray. Katrine Weiss had piled the fire higher until it crackled with a determined cheerfulness. Tea was brought in again, though few cups were finished. People are not thirsty when they are calculating which neighbor might be a murderer. Poirot asked them to remain. He did not say why at first. He merely moved furniture with small, precise gestures until the chairs formed two facing benches imitating the sleigh. Mara helped him, her face grave and steady, and when the arrangement was done he thanked her quietly and sent her to the doorway, not as a servant but as a guard. "We will reconstruct," he said. "Memory is a slippery thing. We must give it a floor to stand on." Felix Brandt tried to laugh and failed. "You're going to make us play sleigh ride indoors?" "Not play," Poirot corrected gently. "Remember." He carried a silver tray from the sideboard and set it on the low table. On it were a sugar bowl, a teaspoon, and a small dish of cocoa powder. It looked almost absurd amid the tension, like a tea service brought to a funeral, yet Poirot's hands treated it with such absorbed care that no one dared smile. "Snow," he said, collecting a teaspoon of sugar, "is like this." He poured a neat white mound onto the tray, then spread it in a narrow band. "It is a surface that records. If you know how to read it, it is not confusion but clarity." He used the back of the spoon to draw two parallel grooves through the sugar. "The sleigh runners. Here is your route from the lodge to the lower ridge. We stopped here." He tapped a small hollow in the sugar at one end. Scattering a faint dust, everyone leaned forward despite themselves. Even Brandt forgot his watch. Miss Edith Lane's pen hovered over her notebook, not writing because she did not yet know what to call what she was watching. Colonel James Harrow's soldier posture had gone very still. Liselot Dale's soft smile had faded into something that might have been only tiredness. Herr Rayner stood behind his chair like a man waiting for a verdict. Poirot set the spoon down. "Now, last night, at the stop, two people left the sleigh." He pressed two sets of small dots beside the grooves. "These were the prints I found. One heavy, one lighter. They went into the trees." His finger traced a path away from the sugar grooves. "Only one returned." He made a single line of dots back to the runners. Felix Brandt's face tightened. We all stayed put. One of you did not, Poirot said softly. He did not point. He did not need to yet. He let the sentence hang until it became a weight in the room. But there was also, Poirot continued, a third set of footprints, smaller, careful. They appeared halfway along the path and vanished near Mr. Reed. Sister Clara James swallowed audibly. The phantom steps, Poirot agreed. And because they looked impossible, you all started to imagine supernatural nonsense. Yet the truth is always simpler than our fears. The third steps were not made after the sleigh returned. They were made earlier. A ripple went through the room. Earlier, Edith repeated. Yes. Poirot took cocoa powder and dusted a faint brown trace beside his sugar grooves. Look, suppose a person walks this path before midnight. Perhaps at 9, perhaps at 10. The snow is fresh then. Their small, careful steps sink in later. At midnight the sleigh passes close by. The wind continues. The snow continues. Edges soften, the prints begin to fade. He tapped each small cocoa, marked hollow lightly. Now imagine that. After the sleigh returns to the lodge, someone steps into those earlier prints again, carefully matching heel to heel. He deepens them. He makes them look fresh. So in the morning we see a trail that seems to begin from nowhere and end at the body. We say, a ghost walked here. But it is no ghost. It is a clever man using old footprints like a mask. Colonel Harrow stared at the tray, then said sharply, so the phantom approach was staged. Exactly, Poirot said, to confuse time, to make us think Mr. Reed was approached after midnight by someone slight, perhaps to lead our minds toward a particular person. But those steps were already there. The killer merely borrowed them. Brandt blurted. Then who made them in the first place? Poirot's eyes did not flicker. We will return to that for now. Understand that the third steps do not prove a third person at the death. They prove only that someone wanted us to believe it. He lifted the spoon again. Now, when was Mr. Reed killed? Not at dawn, his body was too cold, his rigor too advanced. Not at midnight on the ridge, for the sleigh passed near his later resting place and no body was there. So he died after we returned? Katrine said, voice rough. Poirot nodded. Yes, but not by a struggle, not by a chase. Mr. Reed did not walk from this lodge into the meadow. The snow shows no trail from the door, yet he was found beside the runner grooves, placed so that the sleigh's path would be part of the story. He looked at Sister Clara James. Doctor, you told us your sedative can render a man docile, sleepy, even helpless. Clara's face was drawn. Yes. Poirot's gaze moved over them all, not accusatory but intent. Last night, on the sleigh, Mr. Reed was not present, yet someone cried out in the trees, and the horses panicked. In that moment, everyone looked outward. Lantern light bounced. The sleigh jolted. People grabbed each other. Someone could slip away without being seen. But Reed wasn't there to slip away, Brandt protested. Poirot raised a hand. Just so. Therefore the one who slipped away did not go to kill him at that moment. He went to prepare the stage. Mr. Reed, Poirot continued, was killed later, but he was drugged earlier. The word drugged fell like a stone. How? Edith asked. He wasn't with us. Poirot took a breath. You forget one small detail. When a man is sick, he is offered kindness, a hot drink, perhaps a little medicine, perhaps a visit from a doctor. It is easy to place poison or sedative into an act of care. Clara flinched, and Poirot saw the flinch. He did not press it yet. Mr. Reed had a headache, Poirot said. He stayed upstairs. Someone went to him before the sleigh ride, perhaps with tea, perhaps with concern, perhaps with the excuse of discussing old matters in private. He was given a sedative, not enough to kill, only enough to dull his judgment, slow his reflexes, make him pliable. Katrine whispered. He would have trusted a familiar face or a professional one, Poirot replied softly. He turned back to his sugar tray as if the tray were a map of the mind. Now the sleigh ride begins. The killer is on it. During the loop, there is a moment near the ridge when he says to another passenger, or perhaps to the driver, "I must step down for a moment. I need a private word with someone." In the lantern muddle, such a thing seems ordinary. We are all adults. We allow privacy. We turn our faces away from it out of politeness. He dusted cocoa powder in a small sideways arc from the runner groove. 2 people leave the sleigh. 1 heavy, 1 lighter. The heavy one is the killer. The lighter one is Mr. Reed, already sedated enough to be guided rather than to resist. He has been brought out in the dark on the pretext of a private talk. Perhaps about the lodge, perhaps about money, perhaps about forgiveness. He steps where he is led. His footprints are lighter because his balance is failing, his body uncertain. A low sound escaped Lizzie Lauderdale, half breath, half disbelief. Poirot went on, voice calm as a surgeon's. In the trees, away from lantern light, the killer does not kill him yet. He has a different plan. He leaves him, half conscious, perhaps seated, perhaps supported against a trunk, with only one instruction. Wait here. I will fetch something. I will return. The sedative ensures Reed does not wander far. The cold ensures he does not last forever. Edith's voice was thin. Left him to freeze. Yes, Poirot said quietly. A cruel method, but an easy one, because it produces no blood, no obvious violence. It can be called the storm. Brant snapped. That's monstrous. Poirot's eyes were grave. Monstrous. Yes, but not uncommon when hatred is old and patience is long. He tapped the sugar again. The killer returns alone to the sleigh. That is why the heavier prints come back without the lighter ones. He resumes his seat. Perhaps he laughs at a fox joke. Perhaps he shivers and pretends he has only relieved himself behind a tree. No one questions him closely, because we were all shaken by the cry, and by the horses. The cry. Colonel James Harrow said slowly. So that was stage 2. Poirot nodded. A second layer of theatre. A cry gives panic. Panic gives cover. If the cry was human, and I am certain it was, it may have been the killer himself, or an accomplice, or even Mr. Reed, half conscious, frightened by the cold and calling out. But whichever it was, the killer used it. He wished the sleigh to turn back quickly. He wished the ride to end before anyone wondered why 2 people had gone into the trees and only 1 had returned. So Reed was left in the ridge forest, Catherine said hoarsely. But we found him lower, beside the track. Just so, because the killer needed the body to be found in relation to the sleigh route, not hidden away where the snow could keep it for days. He wanted discovery. He wanted a story. We rode at midnight. A cry was heard. At dawn a man is found beside our tracks. Maybe he wandered out and died. Maybe someone met him thereafter. Poirot leaned forward slightly. After the sleigh returned and the lodge quieted, the killer went out again. He did not walk from the door, because that would leave prints. He used a small sled or board already placed near the stable or shed. He carried or slid Reed, who was now dead or nearly dead, down to the lower meadow, keeping to the sleigh groove where his own footprints would merge with existing disturbance. He laid Reed beside the track, half covered him so that the morning snow would make him seem long dead there, and he returned by the groove again. He paused and added softly, "That is why I found the backward bracing steps, a man pulling weight. That is why the snow showed faint slide marks. That is why a glove tore under the pine root. Manipulating a body is not tidy work, even in a storm." The parlor was silent in a way that hurt the ears. One could hear the faint hiss of a lamp wick, the small pop of sap in the fire. Outside, the wind muttered its slow hymn against the shutters, as if chanting a refrain. Felix Brandt's voice came at last, smaller than anyone had heard it. "So the snow was used to hide time." "Yes," Poirot said. "The killer thought fresh fall would confuse the order of events. But snow also preserves shapes. It kept the lie crisp for me to read. He softened edges, I followed patterns." Sister Clara James whispered, "Then you know who it is." Poirot looked at him long enough that Clara's eyes dropped. "I know much," Poirot said. "But not yet everything. A reconstruction explains how. Now we must find why, and whose hands were willing to do it." He set down the spoon and folded his hands. "There is still one question to answer. Who made the earlier small footprints that were later stepped into? Only someone who knew they would be useful would place them there ahead of time. That means forethought. It also means access to the path before midnight, without raising alarm." He let his gaze travel slowly from face to face. "You each will tell me," he said gently, "where you were between supper and the sleigh ride precisely." In that small interval, the killer prepared his phantom trail and his victim. No one moved. No one spoke. But Poirot saw in their stillness the subtle differences he had waited for. The blink that came too late, the hand that tightened, the throat that swallowed dryly. Snow had kept the lie crisp. Now, under lamplight, human nerves would do the rest. "The trick of the tracks," Poirot murmured, almost to himself, "is always a trick on the mind. And the mind, mes amis," he corrected himself at once, smiling faintly, "my friends, is where we will find our murderer." Chapter 8. Bells that ring for the living. The day folded into evening without a true sunset. The storm had taken the sky hostage. There was only a gradual dimming, as if someone had turned down a lamp in a room too large. Pine Hollow Lodge glowed stronger in contrast, windows bright against the blur, firelight edging every beam and chair. Yet warmth is not only temperature until truth is spoken. A house can be as cold as the meadow. Poirot had asked for a final gathering when the lamps were lit. He did not summon them like a magistrate. He invited them as a host might invite uneasy relatives to the same table, with politeness that left no real choice. They came one by one into the parlor, carrying their fear like coats they could not hang up. Catherine Weiss sat in her usual chair by the hearth, but her hands were wrapped tight around her mug, knuckles pale. Mara stood behind her mother, not hovering, not hiding, but steady as a post. Sister Clara James took a seat near the bar, trying to look professional and finding it hard to look anything else. Miss Edith Lane placed herself beside a lamp again, notebook ready in the way a swimmer keeps breath ready. Colonel James Harrow sat straight-backed, still a soldier even in slippers. Liselott Dale chose her corner with the same quiet grace she always used. Herr Rayner stood by the wall, cap in hand, face weather, creased into stern loyalty. And Felix Brandt came last. He had washed and changed since the reconstruction, as if clean collars could lighten guilt. His smile appeared when he entered, too broad, too quick, and the laugh that followed it was a small burst that died in the middle. He sat opposite Poirot, leaned back, crossed one ankle over the other, and made a show of ease. Only his hands betrayed him, restless fingers tapping where his watch would normally lie. Though he had not put it on, Poirot waited until everyone had settled. He had asked for the lamps to be bright, the fire to be high, the chairs to face inward. He did not like revelations in shadow. People should see each other clearly when the last mask drops. "My friends," he began, "you have been very patient with me, and I am grateful. It is not easy to be trapped in a storm with death, but if we have suffered fear, we have at least had the chance to learn. This evening I will tell you what I know. When I finish, you will know it also." Poirot's eyes moved gently over their faces as he spoke, giving each person the courtesy of inclusion. "We begin with what the snow told me," he said. "Two people left the sleigh at the ridge. One returned alone. The third ghost footprints were a trick, made earlier, then stepped into later to fake a phantom approach. These things you have heard already. The question was not how, but who." He paused. The fire crackled. Outside, wind pressed its long, cold mouth against the shutters, chanting for entry. "Mr. Reed," Poirot went on, "was not killed by a blade or by a bullet. He was killed by patience and by cold. He was sedated, guided away under a polite excuse, left to freeze, and later moved beside the sleigh track to be found. The killer believed the storm would confuse time and erase his traces. But snow is a strange clerk. It forgets lines. Yes, but remembers patterns. It kept the shape of the lie crisp for me. He folded his hands. Now we must look at motive. Why would someone do this? Mr. Reed had history with this lodge. He sold it abruptly in the past. People here lost money. Grudges were possible. Yet grudges alone do not explain your night. The killer was not merely angry, he was desperate. Lizelot Dale lifted her eyes slightly, as if a word had touched old memory. Herr Rayner's jaw tightened. Sister Clara James swallowed. Poirot turned his head toward Catherine. Madame, you told us your husband invested in Reed's expansion plans. His loss was severe. Lizelot's soft voice came before Catherine could answer. Theo was charming when he wanted people to follow him. My husband believed in that charm. He died still believing. I did not. Poirot nodded. You had reason to dislike him, yet you had no need to kill him. You are not a woman who runs from a debt by creating another. Her soft smile flickered, almost appreciative. Thank you for understanding that, Poirot continued. Herr Rayner, you were angry. You said aloud that Reed had no right to return, but anger is noisy. Your anger was not hidden, and the murder required secrecy and timing. You also remained in the stable for some time after the ride, and you are too large a man to make the small, careful ghost prints. That shadow is not yours. Rayner nodded once stiffly, perhaps relieved, perhaps ashamed of relief. Miss Lane, Poirot said, turning to Edith, you are curious and too awake. Curiosity can wander, but you would have left a writer's trail, a hesitant path, a pause, perhaps a dropped thought. The snow showed nothing of the sort. Moreover, you heard a door click at 2 and bells after 1. You did not create those sounds. You recorded them, him. Edith exhaled shakily. I didn't want to be part of it at all. None of us ever do, Poirot said kindly. Colonel James Harrow, he said next. Soldiers have discipline, and they have sometimes a taste for clean solutions. But you did not know Reed. Your boots match neither the heavy prints that left and returned, nor the small prints used to stage the ghost trail. You were where you said you were. Even if you were not, your motive would be pale and borrowed. That is not enough for murder. Harrow's spine did not relax. Soldiers rarely relax. But he nodded. Sister Clara James, Poirot said softly. Your sedative vial was stolen. Your bag was left in the parlor when you went upstairs at 12:30. It was taken then, most likely, because the killer needed it before midnight. You had access to Reed as a professional might, and so your shadow briefly fell across my mind. But you checked on Reed openly once, knocked, and left. You did not leave the lodge again. Also, your gloves are intact. The leather scrap by the pine root does not fit you. We may say with respect that you were used. Clara's face tightened with indignation, something like shame. Used how? In your kindness, Poirot replied. The killer borrowed the authority of medicine to cover his act. He let that sink in, then turned to Lizelot once more. You woke at 3, heard footsteps, and did not look. That is not guilt, that is weariness. You have lived long enough to know that looking does not always help. Lizelot lowered her eyes. Flattery would have insulted her. Poirot had offered none. He looked at Mara and Catherine. You two were in the kitchen before the ride, together. The small prints could have belonged to a woman, yes, but to make them earlier, and then step into them later, required leaving the lodge unobserved before midnight and again after. Mara, you were in the parlor after the ride until you went upstairs with your mother's accounts. Catherine, you counted heads as we came in. Neither of you had the intervals required. And you, madame, had no reason to stage your own lodge into scandal. Catherine's tired eyes glistened. Then who? Poirot did not answer at once. He made them wait exactly one breath longer than comfort. Then he turned his head slowly toward Felix Brandt. Monsieur Brandt, he said gently, you are the man who laughed loudly to hide his fear. You are also the man who most needed time to stay quiet. Mr. Reed held proof against you, proof of fraud he intended to expose you once the roads cleared. Brandt's smile stayed on his mouth like a badly fitted mask. This is ridiculous. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps, But let us examine the facts together, so there is no room for misunderstanding. He lifted a finger. First motive. You told us you were a businessman on the way to Vienna. You also told us you came because the slopes were cheap. Yet your coat is expensive and your boots city polished, which suggests a man who wants to appear prosperous. The snow does not show debts, but people do. You checked your watch constantly, not because time was precious in an abstract sense, but because you were counting toward something, toward the moment when your difficulties might be exposed. Brandt barked a laugh. You are making psychology into evidence. Poirot smiled faintly. Psychology is always the beginning. Evidence follows. Second, he said, opportunity. You sat on the sleigh on the side nearest the ridge. When the horses jolted, you were the closest to the drop. You had the strongest reason to step down under cover of panic. In the parlor reconstruction, you could not remember exactly which side you sat on. That is because you were thinking of another detail. But Miss Lane remembered your position, and so did I. Brandt shifted in his chair. His hand went to his knee and squeezed. Third, the sedative Sister Clara James's vial was missing. Only one person had briefly been alone with the doctor's bag in the parlor before midnight. You did not notice when you stood to stretch your legs, while the others were arguing about winter luck. You were away perhaps 40 seconds. 40 seconds is long enough to take a vial if you know what to take. You did know. You have described medicines too accurately for a layman. When a man lives by schemes, he becomes interested in tools. Sister Clara James inhaled sharply. Brandt's face flushed dark. You cannot prove that, Brandt said. Poirot nodded. Not yet. Fourth, a glove, a fragment of fine leather, was torn under the pine root where Reed was placed. Your gloves are city leather. You wore them last night. When we examined boots today, you did not produce your gloves. You said you had mislaid them in your room. Later, when you fetched a pair, they were wool. You changed gloves, monsieur. That is a small thing, but small things are what murderers stumble on. Brandt's eyes darted toward the door. Fifth, the ghost prints. One must prepare those earlier small steps before midnight. One must also deepen them afterward by stepping into them again. To do that, you needed to leave the lodge without being noticed. You did so before supper ended, telling Miss Dale you wished to smoke on the porch. You were gone long enough to walk a short distance down the sleigh route and make a neat trail. Small steps can be made by a large man if he shortens his stride. Snow records length but not intention. Later, after the ride, you left the parlor once more. You said you were fetching your watch from your coat upstairs. You were gone 7 minutes. That was enough to take your sled board from the stable shed, where Raina keeps spare hides. Go down the runner groove, move the body, hide your torn glove scrap, and step carefully into the earlier prints to make them look new. Herr Raina's face went rigid. The shed? How would he know? He watched you harness, Poirot said kindly. People who plan crimes watch everything. Brandt's breathing had become audible, a tight rasp. Still he clung to the last thread. And is that all? He sneered, voice breaking. A story about footprints and my smoking. You don't have proof that Reed had anything on me. Poirot's eyes were sad now. Ah, but I do. He reached into his pocket and produced a small envelope, laid it on the table without flourish. Inside was a folded paper, damp, softened, edges still stiff with cold. This, he said, was in Mr. Reed's coat, a letter he began the night he arrived. He wrote it after speaking to your banker in town last week. It is not finished, but it names the company you claim to represent, and it notes the false invoices you used to secure credit. Mr. Reed had sold this lodge once. He had learned, perhaps, to feel regret for the people he hurt. He intended to repair one wrong by stopping another. Brandt stared at the paper as if it were a snake. Poirot continued softly. You found out he had it, not by magic, but because you went upstairs before the sleigh ride. You said to him, with calm voice and polite tone, that you wished a private business apology, that you had been unfair to him years ago, that you were sorry, that you wanted to speak as men. He was already unwell, already perhaps hopeful of being forgiven. He took the tea you offered. The tea had sedative in it. Brant's mouth opened. No sound came. Poirot's voice remained even, but the room felt the weight of it. On the sleigh. You said you needed a word with him again, perhaps to finish the apology in fresh air. You let him off at the ridge. You left him to freeze. And when you came back you laughed loudly, because loudness is what panic wears when it wants to look like courage. He let the last sentence fall. The fire made a low sigh in the hearth outside. The wind kept chanting, but its hymn had weakened in the parlor, drowned by a smaller and truer sound, Felix Brandt's breath coming apart. Brandt stood up so suddenly, his chair scratched the floor. His face had collapsed inward, as though a building had lost its supports. I didn't mean, he began. Then he stopped, because meaning is a luxury after murder. Liselott Dale's soft voice came across the room like a knife wrapped in cloth. He left my husband with debts he couldn't repay. Now he leaves another man to die in snow. Panic suits him. Brandt turned on her, wild-eyed. You don't understand. He was going to ruin me. I only needed time, a week, maybe. I wasn't angry. I was terrified. Poirot nodded once. Yes, that is why your crime is so pitiful. You were not driven by passion, but by cowardice. You chose death for another to buy yourself a few more days of illusion. Brandt made a raw sound and covered his face with his hands. For a moment he looked very small. Smaller, even than Poirot. Catherine spoke, voice shaking with fury. You used my tradition to kill a man. Brandt did not answer. He was beyond answers now. Poirot stepped forward. He did not touch him. He never touched the guilty unless asked. Monsieur Brandt, he said quietly, you will remain here until the constable arrives. You will not harm yourself. You will not run. There is nowhere to go. If you attempt foolishness, Colonel Harrow will prevent it, and I will regret the necessity. Colonel James Harrow rose smoothly, a soldier again in full measure. He stood near Brandt with a silent certainty that made escape feel childish. Brandt sank back into his chair, shaking. Something in the room loosened then. Not joy, not relief exactly, but the first real breath people take after holding themselves tight for hours. The lodge felt warmer, as if truth itself were a fire that had been lit behind the walls. Edith wiped her eyes without noticing she was doing it. Clara's shoulders sagged with a long, tired exhale. Liselott Dale closed her eyes once, not in grief for Reed, but in weary acknowledgement that one debt had at last been named. Herr Rayner stared at the floor, anger and sorrow tangled. Catherine's tired eyes were wet yet steady. Poirot looked around at them, and his voice softened. This is not a happy ending, he said. A man is dead, and another has destroyed himself, but it is a logical ending. The snow did not lie. It only waited for someone to read it. Outside, a gust slapped the shutters and then faded, as though the storm, too, had heard the verdict and was losing interest. The horses shifted in the stable, and for the first time since last night, their bells rang in a natural way, soft, unforced, like something harmless returning to itself. Poirot turned to Mara. Will you send word to Herr Vogel as soon as a runner can pass? Yes, Monsieur Poirot, she said steadily. He nodded, then looked at Brandt once more. There was no triumph in his gaze, only that moral sadness he carried for all who choose wrong when right is still possible. When the road's clear, he said quietly, the law will come. Until then, we keep order, and we keep mercy for those who deserve it. He allowed himself a small pause, then added with the gentlest irony, and perhaps we will not take midnight sleigh rides for luck again. Luck is a thing that should be invited carefully. A faint, broken sound came from Brandt, half laugh, half sob. No one answered it. The parlor held only the crackle of fire and the breathing of the living. Outside the blizzard still raged, but inside the air eased, and people felt their own hearts again. The bells on the sleigh, finally whole, chimed softly in the stable. They rang not for the dead, but for the living who had been given back their breath, and for truth, which, once spoken, can warm even a storm-bound lodge.